Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this UKLFI Charitable Trust webinar hosted jointly with Camera UK on the BBC. What is it doing and what can we do about it? At a time when the BBC is under unprecedented criticism and public censure for its coverage of Israel, we'll look at some specific examples of the BBC's recent failure to ensure its reports on developments are accurate and impartial, and we'll address what action can be taken. Danny Cohen, the former director of BBC Television, has called for an independent inquiry of the broadcaster, writing recently in the Telegraph of the BBC, on a daily basis, Britain's Jews are being harmed through its unbalanced reporting of the Israel Hamas war and the failure of its senior management to get to grips with it. Well, I'm joined by Hadar Sela of Camera UK, who has closely analysed the BBC's coverage of Israel for over a decade. Originally from the UK, Hadar has lived in Israel for over 3 decades and covers the influence of the media on the British public's perceptions of the Middle East and the Islamist networks operating in the UK. She has authored thousands of posts analysing BBC reports regarding Israel, and her work has been widely published, including in the Jerusalem Post, the Allgemeine, the Commentator, and at Harry's Place. I'm also joined by UKLFI's Chief Executive, Jonathan Turner, who has made some of the few complaints about the BBC's reporting on Israel that have been accepted by the BBC. Jonathan has practiced as a barrister for over 40 years. He co-founded UK Lawyers for Israel in 2011 and has played a leading role in its activities since then. Prior to that, he assisted Trevor Assison in the preparation of BBC Watch reports on the BBC's coverage of Israel. It's very good to have you with us, ladies and gentlemen. Please put your questions for our panel into the Q&A facility on Zoom, and we'll come to them in the context of the discussion to follow presentations from our speakers. Hadar, it's very good to have you with us, and I look forward to your remarks on the recent reports that you have done over BBC's coverage.
Thanks very much. So, as Natasha said, I'm the co-editor of Camera UK. My colleague Adam deals with the rest of the British media. I do just the BBC, but they keep me busy enough. And I've been doing that since 2012 when we started. We were originally called BBC Watch, and then a few years ago we merged and did Camera UK. I work very closely with my colleagues at Camera Arabic, which is another branch of Camera that we set up a few years ago. And Camera Arabic deals with mainstream media outlets that broadcast or publish content in Arabic, not the Al Jazeeras of this world, but the BBC, Deutsche Welle, CNN have Arabic as well, and so on and so forth. Since October 7th, I think maybe the sentence that comes to mind is plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. The only new thing, in my view, that we've seen is the actual amount of reporting. There's been a tremendous rise in the amount of reporting. It's actually quite difficult to keep up with, and in Arabic too. We've seen things that have happened in the past in similar cases when there were conflicts, such as in 2014. And one of those is I call it the parachuting of reporters into the area who aren't permanently based here. Some of them have been very problematic in the past, such as John Donnison, who is back on the block, Ola Gurin, Jeremy Boyne, of course. And that's a phenomenon that we see nearly every time there's some sort of a rise in tensions. They bring in these parachuted reporters. Another thing you see is bringing in reporters with absolutely no Middle East knowledge or no Middle East experience. And so last week, for example, we had a Europe reporter called Nick Beek reporting. These people are very often not totally au fait with what goes on here and don't really understand what they're reporting on. Another issue that that is, again, there's nothing new about this, but it's come to a head in these past few weeks, is the issue of BBC Arabic. I don't know if you saw a report around the 15th of October that six BBC Arabic reporters and one freelancer were actually suspended by the BBC for Hamas tweets that they had put on social media. They were suspended with pay. These tweets, Hamas supporting tweets, I should say, on supporting the massacre of October 7th. They were suspended with pay. And we just learned yesterday or the day before that they've now been brought back to work. One has either quit or been fired. We're not entirely sure. They've been recommended to go to something called neutrality training, but there's been no public apology as far as the BBC is concerned. Examples of particularly bad reporting that we've seen this time, there was, again, BBC Arabic has been very, very bad. They have a program called Trending, which generally deals with issues in the news. And it's on television and it's put up on YouTube as well. They have a YouTube channel. They did a whole thing on the massacre in Kfar Aza, which they actually whitewashed the entire massacre. People were told that there were different versions of the story and different pictures, and Hamas denials were amplified. They were told that Hamas had said it only targeted the military and civilians and children were spared. We, via the Telegraph, we worked with the Telegraph on that one, and we got it taken down from YouTube. But again, there's been no public apology for this standard of coverage. I think the main thing that everybody will be familiar with was the BBC's reporting on the October 17th explosion at the Al-Ahli hospital in the Gaza Strip, which was a Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket. The BBC, John Donnison, rushed to tell BBC News Channel viewers that given the size of the explosion and the amount of people reported killed, which of course he was quoting Hamas casualty figures, he couldn't see that it could be anything else other than Israeli airstrike. 2 days, there was a lot of complaints about that. And 2 days later, the BBC put out a clarification. You may also have seen, the Telegraph recently reported, the BBC's ECU, its Executive Complaints Unit, addressed complaints submitted by the Board of Deputies and by CAA, Campaign Against Anti-Semitism, which were fast-tracked to the ECU by Tim Davie, the BBC Director General. So they didn't go through the usual very tiring complaints process. The ECU rejected those complaints, but the basis for its rejection was extremely interesting, because they actually rejected those complaints on the basis of their own reporting. In May this year, the BBC set up a department called BBC Verify, and I'll talk about them a little bit more later, which is supposed to be a fact-checking department, an anti-disinformation department. And BBC Verify did three pieces actually on the Al-Ahli incident, in which they said that they couldn't reach a conclusion what had actually happened, and there were conflicting versions of the story. And the ECU actually used those BBC Verify reports to reject the complaints made on the topic, which is, I think, highly, highly notable. We've got the BBC now relying on its own content in order to reject complaints about its own content. You may have seen as well last Saturday, Jeremy Bowen was on BBC News Channel doing an interview in which he said he had no regrets about his reporting on that incident, even though he had said that the hospital building was flattened, and it wasn't. The hospital building itself wasn't touched. The explosion happened in the car park. that's been one of the topics that I think has got the BBC even on the radar of people who maybe it wasn't on their radar before. Another example has been the tunnels under Shifa Hospital and other hospitals such as Al-Antisi. The BBC has done its level best to downplay all the discoveries by the IDF. I don't know if you're sort of following this very closely, but there were sort of 3 sets of information released by the IDF, with the last one, the most recent one, being the most comprehensive and the biggest. Interestingly, the BBC has not reported on the latest developments that were published by the IDF. The messaging, the framing of the BBC's coverage of the Shifa Hospital story has been that the Israeli army, or Israel, justified its invasion of the Gaza Strip, saying that it had to eliminate this terrorist infrastructure. And so far, Israel has failed to prove that this terrorist infrastructure is actually of any importance. And so that negates Israel's reasons for invading the Gaza Strip. That's been the framing that people have been seeing. An interesting topic from a British point of view, I think, is BBC coverage of the Rafah crossing into Egypt, which is the only crossing that remains open at the moment, of course. Quite a lot, hundreds, in fact, of British nationals got stuck in Gaza or found themselves stuck in Gaza at the beginning of the war. There were people on holiday. There were some people who had actually relocated to Gaza, which sort of contradicts the BBC's long-standing presentation of Gaza as an open prison, where you can't get anything nice or decent food. As you may know, Hamas refused to let foreign nationals out for a good few weeks. The BBC's coverage of that story erased Hamas from the picture entirely, but it has given an awful lot of amplification to complaints from dual Palestinian British nationals about the UK government not doing enough to get them out of Gaza, supposedly. Another interesting story was on the first day, on October 7th, there was a very serious incident in Sderot, at the police station in Sderot. The BBC mentioned that story, but it completely failed to mention that most, if no, not all, but most of the police staff on duty that day and others were murdered during that incident. That aspect of the story didn't get any BBC coverage. I've been focusing quite a lot, or trying to focus quite a lot, on this BBC Verify brand that was set up in May 2023 as a disinformation and fact-checking branch of the BBC. One of the reasons is that I've been focusing on it is because not only is it supposed to bring BBC audiences factual and fact-checked information, but it's been used by the BBC and by Deborah Turnis in particular to try to recruit advertisers, foreign advertisers. There's no advertising on BBC domestic content, but there certainly is on its foreign content. And they've been using that brand to try to recruit advertising. Much of their work so far has been very disappointing. For instance, the music festival that there was at Re'im, where the terrible massacre took place. If you remember, Hamas terrorists came in on paragliders to that music festival. The BBC Verify report on that incident described pictures. There are pictures of the paragliders coming in, but they described the paraglider as clouds of smoke, most likely from Israel's Iron Dome rockets. That's not fact-checking. Another thing I think it's very worth paying attention to is the coverage of the demos or demonstrations in the UK, the anti-Israel demonstrations in the UK. Coverage of demonstrations is always problematic. We've seen it in the past. And as usual, they downplay Hamas, downplay the support for Hamas, downplay the anti-Semitism, whitewashing people who are organizing these demonstrations and their links to Hamas. But this time there was some particularly notable coverage as well. There was an article, or even two articles, by the BBC's religion editor, Alim Makboul, which spent more than half of an article whitewashing the "From the River to the Sea, Palestine will be free" slogan, and explaining or telling BBC audiences that it means that they just want liberty and human rights for all the people from the river to the sea. I mean, that's just ridiculous. Another interesting thing we saw was an article about demonstrations in Scotland, where the BBC actually advertised the date, time, and place of a whole series of demonstrations in Scotland. I found that one particularly interesting. As far as I know, the BBC isn't supposed to do advertising at all. So advertising demonstrations would seem not to be within their remit as far as I'm concerned. Another interesting sort of way of looking at things is what's not being reported. On October 7th, 4 Israeli journalists were murdered by Hamas. BBC audiences have seen nothing on that topic, but they've seen a lot of coverage of Palestinian and Lebanese journalists who've been killed. We've seen no effort or no attempt by any BBC reporter to go visit the people who lived in the kibbutzim around Otef Aza, who have now been taken to hotels and other kibbutzim, and they're actually refugees, if you like, in their own country. You would think, from a human interest point of view, there might have been some BBC reporting on those people who've lost their houses, their homes, all their possessions, members of their families. Nothing. There's been no reporting, for example, on how this has affected Israel's economy, all the people who can't work, the people whose businesses are closed, nothing at all. So on the one hand, it's been very bad this time, but on the other hand, you can say there's actually nothing new, because we've seen similar reporting, maybe not to such a scale, but we've definitely seen similar reporting in the past. We've seen the BBC using Hamas casualty figures in the past. They certainly did in the 2014 conflict, and they made no effort whatsoever to verify casualty figures that they were given on their own. We've seen some terrible reporting this year with regard to Palestinian casualties in Judea and Samaria in the anti-terrorism operations there, who've been passed off as after complaints. They've been described as, say, for example, 1,000 people have been killed, including militants and civilians, but with absolutely no explanation that the vast majority have been either terrorists or people involved in serious violence at the time. Again, I think we can look at the past and say that the writing was definitely on the wall. I'm sure you all remember the Oxford Street story last year, the BBC's coverage of the Oxford Street Hanukkah incident, when they told BBC audiences that the children or the young people who were attacked had been making racist chants from inside a bus. There was a story in 2012, I don't know if you remember it. There was operation in Gaza, and the infant son of a BBC employee in its Gaza office, because the BBC is one of the few Western media organizations to still have an office in the Gaza Strip. The baby son of one of their employees was killed, and about 5 months later, it turned out that he'd been killed by a short-fall rocket. The BBC, when it happened, went really overboard on Israel has killed babies. And when the actual information came out a few months later, it was the UN that said it was a Hamas rocket. They had to backtrack, but it was distinctly not enthusiastically delivering people the truth. In 2014, there was an incident at the Shati refugee camp in the Gaza Strip. Again, a short-fall rocket that fell and killed several children, I think 9 or 10. Again, the BBC initially described that as an Israeli strike. It was later shown that it was a short-fall rocket. That incident is still on the BBC website, described as a disputed deadly incident. So this editorial policy, because I can't really think it's anything else, of as they're doing now with the Al-Ahli hospital, they've done it before. We won't say it was a Hamas rocket or an Islamic Jihad rocket. We will call it a disputed deadly incident. We will say we can't find out what exactly happened. They know what happened. But then again, I think it's worth remembering that the BBC still has reports about a so-called massacre in Jenin refugee camp in 2002 on its website for everybody to look at and see and believe if they so wish to. The significant criticism this time, I think there's been a significant rise in criticism, both in the British press and in the public, among the public. That's made the BBC do damage control. But I don't think anybody should be under the impression that they are changing their spots or learning anything or anything of that, or repenting, anything of that style. There was the whole issue at the beginning of the BBC not using the word terrorism or terrorists to describe Hamas. If you remember, John Simpson wrote an article on the BBC News website. Deborah Turnis, the BBC press office, put out a press release on that topic. And so at the moment they're not calling them terrorists, but they're saying that the British government designates Hamas as a terrorist organization. I wouldn't rely on that as a permanent change. We've had no assurance that it's going to be a permanent change. In my opinion, it's not good enough either. They're now saying, again, they didn't at the beginning, but they are now saying that the casualty figures they use are supplied by the Ministry of Health, which is run by Hamas. That's an addition. But I wouldn't regard this as any sort of a permanent change in BBC policy. I think it's far too optimistic to look at it that way. As we know, in times like this, in times of conflict, very often the BBC resorts to putting out standard template responses to complaints, and they've been doing that this time as well. They have a one-size-fits-all response that they, regardless of what you complained about, they put it out. The complaint system, I'm sure many of us know, has long been unfit for use, and it doesn't serve the interests of the BBC's funding public. The Ofcom, the introduction of Ofcom in 2017 as an external adjudicator has been, in my opinion, utterly ineffective. The midterm review that's going on at the moment is a government-only review. There's been no public consultation. And as you may remember, last December, it was announced that there was going to be a parliamentary inquiry into the BBC. I personally have no idea what's happening with that. I haven't heard anything about it, and I can't provide any news on that. But maybe Jonathan can. So over to you, Jonathan.
Well, thank you for that depressing account, Hadar. Can we do anything about it? Well, I'm going to look at some of the possibilities and review how they can be invoked and whether they're likely to get anywhere. I'm going to look at 4 areas, and I'll just mention what they are so that you can keep track of where I'm going. But first of all, I'm going to look at regulation in relation to specific examples where you can identify a particular program, particular broadcast that has been lacking in accuracy or lacking in impartiality, or has been offensive, or something that is, we would say, contrary to the BBC's regulatory obligations. Then I'm going to look at regulation more broadly reviews and inquiries and investigations, and whether there's any possibility there or any prospect there. Then I'm going to look at legal claims that are based on other general rights. So the possibility of a claim for defamation against the BBC in respect of certain things, or the possibility of some kind of claim for negligence as to whether anything is viable there. So starting with regulation in relation to specific examples, it's necessary to understand a bit about how the BBC is regulated. The starting point is that the BBC is funded by the licence fee that is demanded of everyone who wants to watch broadcast television in the UK, even if they're not interested in the BBC. This has a historical background and may have made some historical sense when broadcasting was in its infancy as a way of getting it off the ground. But it's very difficult to see an objective justification today, except that it's the way it has been operated for years. But as I would sometimes put it, it's as if someone who wants to read an article in The Sun 1 week or 1 day has to take out a year or at any rate 6 month subscription to The Guardian. It's a very odd way of doing things, but at any rate, it is the basis for the BBC being quite heavily regulated, at least in theory. Other broadcast television and indeed radio is also regulated in the UK. But the BBC is, in some respects, at any rate, more regulated than the other channels. So there are several. It's made very complicated by the way it's been handled. You have the requirements in the Communications Act that apply to all broadcasters. You have requirements or at any rate matters set out in the BBC's Royal Charter, because it's constituted under the Royal Charter. And then there's a rather important document called the Framework Agreement between the government and the BBC. And I've just mentioned that the charter under which the BBC is currently operating and the framework agreement that accompanied it were reissued in December of 2016. However, there was a very important amendment, in my view, in an agreement of May 2022, which accompanied some discussions about the level of the licence fee. The position was that historically the BBC had an obligation to cover news and current affairs with due accuracy and due impartiality. Then it was decided that the BBC should have external regulation by Ofcom instead of being principally regulated by its governing body, because that had insufficient independence. So that was the big change that was made in December 2016. But rather unfortunately, the way it was set up was to say that the BBC had to do what Ofcom decided that it had to do, rather than having independent, freestanding obligations of accuracy and impartiality. And this meant that if you objected to the accuracy or impartiality, you had to follow a procedure. Another aspect of it was that what they call the BBC First approach would apply in relation to accuracy and impartiality and various other content standards. So you had to complain to the BBC first and go through several stages of the BBC process. And then you had to complain if you didn't like the result of that, you had to complain to Ofcom, and only then could you potentially challenge something. But what you could challenge under the system adopted in December 2016, at any rate, probably is the case in my view, what you could only do was challenge Ofcom's decision, and you could only challenge it really on the basis either that Ofcom had followed an incorrect procedure, or that Ofcom's decision was irrational, that no reasonable regulator could have reached that decision. So a very high standard would apply. Now, the reason why I say the amendment in May 2022 was important was that in a very obscure and sleight of hand way, it, as far as I can see, it reintroduced the direct requirement to comply with standards of accuracy and impartiality. Not a wholly freestanding one, because it was by reference to the BBC's editorial guidelines, but it did impose a direct obligation on the BBC, which hadn't existed in previously or since 2016, imposed direct obligation on the BBC to comply with the BBC's editorial guidelines, which do lay down requirements of accuracy and impartiality and not causing offence or undue offence, at any rate, contrary to normal standards and so forth. And indeed, the requirements of accuracy and impartiality are laid out in some detail in the editorial guidelines. If they were actually enforced in accordance with a reasonable interpretation of the language, quite a lot of the content of the BBC in relation to Israel and the Middle East would be found to violate. And I'll discuss that a bit more in a moment. But the effect of the May 22 amendment was, it seems to me, that you can actually challenge the BBC directly by a court proceeding, potentially, for not complying with its editorial guidelines. Now, there is still a basic principle that's adopted by the administrative court. It has a discretion as to whether to intervene, and an approach which is applied generally across the board is that if there is some kind of complaints procedure of the organisation whose conduct is being investigated, a complainant should operate that procedure first, and until that procedure is exhausted, shouldn't apply to the court, or at any rate, the court may stay the proceedings. And the BBC always invoke this if you don't do that, if you don't follow through their generally tedious complaints procedure. There may be some changes in that respect, which I'll come to when I talk about broader regulation. And it seems to me that the administrative court will apply that approach. But there is a question as to whether you have to go to Ofcom before you can, before they'll allow an administrative a claim for judicial review to proceed, or whether you can initiate the judicial review proceeding after you've exhausted the BBC's own complaints procedure without having to go through yet another procedure with Ofcom, which is itself a several stage procedure. That's the that sort of system with complaints and or the procedure, if you like, with complaints and challenging them potentially in court. Of course, if you try and do a court challenge, you're into a procedure that is potentially expensive if you don't succeed, and the court will tend to assume that the BBC, the epitome of the British establishment, the court's assumption will be that the BBC is right and someone complaining about it must have got the wrong end of the stick, or must be opinionated and basically you've got quite a significant burden simply because the BBC still has, particularly in the more establishment circles in Britain, a very strong reputation, and they will be represented very effectively by the best lawyers that money can buy. And if you lose the proceedings, you have to pay their costs, basically. There are some possibilities for having costs capped, but you have to provide a full disclosure of the means available to you, and these processes are very rarely exercised, so that's quite difficult. But I just want to explain a bit more about the various documents. So I mentioned the Charter and the agreement and the amendment to the agreement. Another area of regulation which exists in parallel is that the BBC has to be licensed by Ofcom. And the Ofcom is able to impose conditions in the operating license of the BBC and can amend them at any time. This is more important, particularly in relation to the broader regulation, but I want this to be taken into account when one's looking at complaints as well. And then I mentioned the BBC's editorial guidelines, and they are very important, and they are the standards by which complaints will be considered, at least in theory, in the BBC's internal procedure, the BBC First procedure. And then you have, under generally similar headings, but slightly different standards in Ofcom's own code. Basically what happened was that when Ofcom was told it had to regulate the BBC, Ofcom said, well, we're not going to have a different set of rules for the BBC than we have for other channels. That's far too complicated for our staff to handle. We'll only do it if we got the same rules, and they persuaded the government that's the case. So when you're at the BBC going through their complaints procedure, you have one set of rules. When you go to Ofcom, you have a different set of rules, just to make life simple for everyone else. So the editorial guidelines and the Ofcom code cover a number of areas. We're most interested in this context in accuracy and impartiality, but there are other ones that are worth remembering and may be applicable as well. For example, offensiveness. If the BBC's broadcast is so offensive that it falls below generally accepted standards, that is actually a separate ground of complaint, worth remembering. If it's a children's programme, there are some separate rules about children's programmes and so on. So it is worth bearing those in mind if you are going to make a complaint. And then the whole process is designed to bog people down and deter people from continuing. There was originally one stage, then a second stage, and then the governing body. Well, now it's stage 1A, stage 1B, and then a stage 2, which is the editorial complaints unit. And then if you go on to appeal to Ofcom, you have Ofcom's procedure, which has a couple of basic stages with a possibility of review. Maybe 3 stages really in the Ofcom procedure. Not surprisingly, it's been noticed that the procedure is terribly cumbersome, and people are very unsatisfied with it. And actually, Ofcom did a report on it, which came out last year, I think it was, or was it earlier this year? And they did some quantitative research, which they looked at people who complained. They also had to go at following, and they had sort of spoof complaints, as it were, and they saw what happened when people tried to use the procedure. They came out with a report that said that it was very unsatisfactory, is very unsatisfactory, And what they've actually did was that they then put into the current license some interesting extra obligations of the BBC to provide much more information about what was happening with complaints. And I do get the impression that Ofcom are beginning to possibly take their responsibilities a bit more seriously than they did in the first place when they originally given the task of monitoring the BBC. Possibly it may be associated with the fact that a number of, until fairly recently, most of the Ofcom board were ex-BBC, and the proportion actually has now significantly reduced, and there's a rather more varied composition. I don't know whether that has anything to do with it. But at any rate, the Ofcom does seem to be following what's going on in the complaints process in a way that they haven't before. But for now, at any rate, it remains cumbersome, and you have to keep on the ball and be persistent and pursue things and go on. And there is a possibility of legal action, but you have to have a really good case that the court will understand. The court will find it very difficult to grapple with something where there's been a lot of coverage, because the BBC will bamboozle it, as it were, with saying, well, yes, but we reported, we clarified it here, and we put on this programme there where we explained exactly what happened, and we invited users to look at the website and so on and so forth. And overall, our coverage was duly accurate and duly impartial, is what they'll say. So you have to find something that is really quite specific, which makes it more difficult for them to do that. But on the other hand, you want something that at least is an epitome of more general problems, because if it's a very recherche thing, it's rather easy for them to say, well, it's very unimportant, very unusual, very special, and nothing to do with our normal coverage. We are, and I think other people are, looking quite closely now at the possibility of a legal claim. And I would encourage people, if they've got something that they think might be a good basis for a legal claim, to actually let us know. And if they want to help with the funding of this, what we're particularly concerned about above all is the risk of having to pay the BBC's costs if we lose. If people want to assist, please do come forward and let us know. So I've talked a bit about the broader regulation, but Ofcom does actually have very wide-ranging powers. They haven't so far very much exercised them, but they do have these powers. They can impose license conditions, they can impose fines, they can review the compliance of the BBC with its obligations in a general way. They have funds to carry out extensive research and reporting. It is something that I think we should be considering, whether there is, whether we can persuade Ofcom or encourage it to go further with these processes. And there is, as Hadar mentioned, something that is going on at the moment. The Charter actually provides for midterm reviews in between. The Charter itself, it goes for 10 years, divided into 5 years, 5-year slots. And in the middle of each 5-year slot, there is supposed to be a midterm review, and it's carrying out one now. What exactly it's considering is not clear, but this may be why. In fact, the Ofcom report into the complaints procedure was done with a view to feeding into that. So again, I do think there is a possibility there, and we shouldn't give up hope on that, and that's another button that we could press. But just very quickly, because people often ask about this as to, well, isn't it defamatory and so on? The position is that UK defamation law, like most defamation laws, protects individuals and private entities, as opposed to government bodies and public entities. So an army can't sue. A whole people, you can't say, oh, well, the Jewish people have been defamed. They can sue, or the people of Israel have been defamed and can sue. No, you can't. It's got to be an individual or a company or possibly a charity or whatever. They can sue. And just occasionally from time to time, this may crop up. On a different channel, I thought that Mark Regev had been defamed. Someone accused him of being dishonest. dishonest like other other Israeli spokesmen, someone said. I thought that would give rise to a defamation action. But if you're an Israeli public official, the Israeli government or Israeli ministries will be very reluctant to let you proceed because they'll be very concerned, first of all, about the protocol of having an Israeli citizen litigating on some kind of public matter in a foreign court, but also the fact that there are disclosure obligations and so on about documents coming into the public domain that might provide information to the enemy and so on. Ariel Sharon did manage to sue. He insisted on getting permission to sue Time magazine quite a few years back. The jury did actually find that the article in the Time magazine was untrue, but under US law, the claimant had to show it was intentionally untrue. The jury said we actually thought that it was negligently untrue, but not intentionally untrue. So the case was lost, but it did, I think, worry broad media to encourage them to be a bit more careful. So it did, in a way, achieve an object.
Jonathan, I'm conscious of the
Yes,
unprecedented interest we've had in this webinar, the numbers of people joining, and also the astonishing number of questions, which is testament to the depths of feeling here and concern. And I hope I might be able to move on to put as many of them as possible to the two of you in the time we've got remaining. One question which has been put in many different ways, but is a constant, ultimately comes down to why. We've talked about the what, and Hadar, you've given us some very, very important examples, and Jonathan, you've come in with the what we can do about it. But Hadar, could you shed any light on why you think the BBC has been so tremendously bad on this in light of the many years of monitoring that you've engaged in?
Well, that's a very difficult question. People sometimes say to me, is the BBC anti-Semitic? The BBC is an enormous organization. There are 2,000 journalists alone, not including the rest of the staff. I think it's a big mistake to try and brand it all with the same colors. And as we saw last week, there were BBC employees who went to an anti-Semitism demonstration despite the BBC having told them not to go. So I don't think we can paint everybody with the same brush. I think there's a lot of British historical background here. I think the whole post-colonial guilt thing, the fact that the BBC was active when Britain had its mandate here in Palestine, and there was some pretty awful BBC coverage then as well. So I think there's a historical view to it. But generally speaking, I think that there is this sort of, I don't know, I don't really like the word progressive, but let's say progressive way of thinking these days in the world, which is actually very shallow. And our conflict is a very, very complicated one. And you have to be pretty dedicated to get right to the bottom and understand it. And these days, I'm sorry to say, I sound really old now. These days, people don't want to. They don't want to spend more than 4 minutes on TikTok trying to find out something about something. Mm. And so I think the BBC is very conscious of its audiences. We're always seeing it complaining that not enough young people watch the BBC, that they're trying to appeal to younger audiences, and so on and so forth. That may be a reason why the quality of coverage is falling as well, because it's trying to be more, let's get it all into a 30-minute sound, into a 30-second soundbite. But I think it's a very, very complicated question. I'm not even sure that there is a real one factor answer to it.
Multifaceted. In fact, in your response, you've already touched on a number of different questions that have also been posed by our audience, in particular, the impact of social media and the comparison of the reporting that you've seen on the BBC, but also important BBC figures like Gary Lineker and his recent tweets. What do you make of the impact on, his 8.7 million followers, as well as the BBC viewership?
He's a bit of a mystery to me because he seems to be able to get away with murder, to be honest. I mean, it's not the first time he's been in the news with all sorts of problematic issues. The BBC has an extensive set of guidelines on the use of social media by its staff. Now, it depends what your job is in the BBC as to which actually restrictions apply to you. So people who are the front of news programs, for example, are not supposed to tweet their opinions about anything, basically. But Gary Lineker got some sort of a get out of jail free card at some point, and because he's not a news presenter. There's a lot of problems with social media, a lot of problems. This story with the 6 BBC Arabic journalists, it was all on Twitter, for example. We've had examples in the past as well. It's something that the BBC, I think it's very difficult to keep on top of it, but the BBC certainly, despite the promises from Tim Davie when he came into the job, he said he was going to clamp down on this and ensure the BBC's impartiality. We haven't really seen that happen.
Yeah, I can add a bit on the Gary Lineker subject, because I actually made a complaint about a tweet that he'd made, which was contrary to the social media guidance that existed at the time. But in relation to another investigation, Gary Lineker threatened to resign and asked some of his friends to threaten to resign, and the BBC got scared and decided they would review the social media guidelines. And whilst that was going on, consideration of my complaint was suspended. And then they came up with new media guidelines, which removed under which what it said wouldn't be contrary to them, because basically provided him with a get out of jail card, as it were. And they said that it's been agreed that we should start with a clean slate, and therefore any previous complaints will be ignored.
They'll be coming in thick and fast, I'm sure, in light of recent developments. We've had a number of questions about individual figures on the BBC, the old guard, Bowen, of course, Orla Guerin, and I think, Hadar, you've certainly touched on some of the difficulties surrounding them, but also questions about fresh blood. How can we possibly engage with the younger journalists, the TikTok generation that you've described, to ensure that the situation doesn't worsen? Do you have any thoughts on training?
The young generation of BBC journalists?
Well, BBC for this purpose, but I'm sure it's the case across broadcasters. Certainly had questions also in relation to Sky, as well as Al Jazeera. So the themes are common.
Sometimes we haven't had any changes in the guard here for quite a while, but in the past I've seen new people being assigned to the Jerusalem bureau here. And they come in quite fresh-faced and enthusiastic, and in the beginning they seem to sort of make an effort to report accurately, and then as time goes on, you see them falling into the same practices that the old guard have been using for a long time. I think. People sometimes say to me, is it ever going to change at the BBC? And I say, well, not until Jeremy Bowen retires, definitely not. But I think we haven't got long to go on that, actually, as far as I'm aware. But I think, if you're a new, young reporter in a massive organisation like the BBC, if you want to keep your job, first of all, you have to conform. And the people setting the tone are this old guard, so to speak. The BBC has a college of journalism, of course. I'm sure you know that, where new journalists get training. And the person in charge of the Middle East program there is Jeremy Boyne. So they're getting taught in the same frameworks and the same I can't think of the word in English, the same perceptions that have been going on for years. So,
within that same framework. And of course, Matthew Friedman has written extraordinarily powerfully about his experiences
with AP,
with the AP in Jerusalem and the editorial frameworks. So much of that seems, Jonathan, to come down to what many of our questioners have asked about as a moral equivalence between Hamas and the IDF. And a couple of questions have focused on why the BBC is now describing Hamas as designated as a terrorist organization, but not saying that it actually is a terrorist organization. The explanation that we have had is that the BBC doesn't wish to, I think, use divisive language or look as though it's drawing conclusions or judgments. But of course, that is so out of step with the nature of the rest of its reporting, examples of which Hadar has given. Can you comment on particularly that the use of the term terrorist and its designation on the BBC?
Well, it has been the BBC's position for many years previously that it doesn't use the word terrorist, it claims, because that implies a kind of judgment, and they say that it's a term that's not, people understand it in different ways, and it's much better, the BBC used to say, that to just describe what happened without labeling it as terrorist. But this is not really true at all, because they have used the word terrorist in relation to many terrorist attacks. It's just when they're terrorist attacks on Israelis that they have found it very difficult to use the term, and does seem to be symptomatic of a general bias, and eventually the pressure on them from senior politicians, including, I think, the Prime Minister, from figures in the lawyers in the House of Lords, including some of our honorary patrons, and the media, to call what was obviously terrorist attacks, became just so great that they eventually came to this compromise that they would give guidance to their journalists to refer to the fact that Hamas is a designated terrorist organization in accordance with UK law. And one factor, of course, that has changed is that it's fairly recently that Hamas was fully prescribed under UK law. It was designated under financial freezing legislation in the UK, but not prescribed under the Terrorism Act. Only the armed wing of Hamas was prescribed until quite recently. That has been changed. The government has now made it fully prescribed. So that was an additional reason that, to the extent the BBC said, well, it's not the law that they are a terrorist organisation. Well, that was wrong as well. Indeed, they are a terrorist organisation as defined by the International Convention on providing support for terrorism. So that was never a very good excuse, but once it was dealt with under UK law, it was a completely nonsensical excuse.
I mean, understandably, we're focusing on individual incidents here, but many of the questions are going to the sort of broader false equivalence, and in particular, this concern over interviewers making throwaway comments that are historically incorrect, that go uncorrected and serve to reinforce the false information which has already been heard by the public. It's that broader brush, and it's those by the way comments that are frequently thrown in that seem to be causing the most concern across the questions that the audience are raising, and that's incredibly difficult to challenge. Lots of people asking whether complaints are in fact the right way forward, because it's very difficult to deal with that broad brush misrepresentation on a case-by-case complaint basis. Hadar, what are your views on how to best tackle that?
Yeah, it's very frustrating, definitely. The complaint system is geared in a way that you have to make a complaint about a specific thing, and it needs to relate to a specific part of the BBC's editorial guidelines. You can't just write in and say the BBC's coverage is awful. That doesn't work. It needs to be very specific, and you also need to be very determined, because they will try to put you off at stage 1A and try to put you off at stage 1B, and most likely try to put you off at stage 2 as well. But it can be done. I mean, we do get results from complaints, but not as much as I think we should. The process itself is incredibly frustrating. There's supposed to be a time limit. They're supposed to reply to you within 20 days. They never do. And then they send you an email saying, oh, we've run out of time, sorry, which is really not helpful. The broad brush thing, I think it's something that can't be dealt with specifically through the complaint system. You can deal with specific points, but you can't deal with the broad brush thing. You can't deal with the throwaway remarks unless they're particularly bad. And I really think that, I mean, I've been battling the BBC's complaint system for over a decade now. I've got results, but nowhere near the way it should be. And things repeat themselves. The fact that you've managed to secure a reasonable response to a complaint doesn't mean that issue isn't going to arise again in the future. It's as if nothing is learned. I rather like Danny Cohen's idea of an independent review. I have to say, I very much liked that idea, because I think this whole BBC self-regulation thing has reached the end of its sustainability, and I think it's time for some sort of outside review, and a really independent, truly independent review, not Ofcom, not the BBC.
Well, on that, Jonathan,
can I just pick up something on that then?
And can I also ask you to address on that? A lot of people are asking about institutional racism at the BBC, and whether an independent inquiry like that might be the best mechanism for getting to the bottom of it. Also, people asking whether calling the BBC institutionally racist might be defamatory, given that you picked up defamation in the other direction. Could I ask you to deal with those aspects also?
Yes. So I think you can make a generalized complaint, actually. However, if you make a generalized complaint, it's very difficult to get it across with attenuate if you've got relatively limited resources. In fact, probably very difficult to get it across at all, because if you're saying, well, the BBC generally does this, they will come back and say, well, we didn't do it here, we did the opposite there. They have access to all their material. It's very easy for them to pick it up. What's more, they can go to professors at universities who will say, we've analysed this, we've got our students or we've got researchers to analyse all the times that they said Israel and all the times that they said this and so on. They can do this, and it is the only way of actually getting something like this properly investigated is if you have a properly impartial general investigation of the kind, because it's not something that can be done by an individual or even group of individuals or organization sort of doing it in that format. You've really got to have an organization with power to requisition evidence and to go into it in that way to deal with a general problem. And incidentally, I might mention that an example of that general problem was in that famous interview of Natasha. Was quite an example of that, slipping in something right at the end. Anyway, as regards institutional bias and institutional racism and so on, I mean, I think first of all, you have to be very careful that it isn't counterproductive using language like that, because you know, the way things work in Britain, you're often better off not if you make remarks that are seen as going over the top. It often devalues or undermines confidence in what you're saying. It's usually not the best way of getting a result. It could well be defamatory. The BBC could sue people for defamation. I think probably, maybe not, because it may be treated as too public an organisation to have rights to sue for defamation. I don't think the BBC would actually. I think they will partly feel that they are above it and they don't need to, and in a sense they are. As the biggest, most powerful broadcasting organisation in the world, probably, they've got plenty of ways of getting their case across. And this is another general point about trying to address the BBC. I think it's a point that's been made to me recently, and it certainly echoes my previous experience, is that if you're going to take on the BBC, you also need to have a good public relations strategy as well. So when I did a complaint against Jeremy Bowen in the past, and he was found to have written a whole piece about the Six-Day War that was lacking impartiality, you know, I got the result, but the BBC then exercised its power to diminish and undermine the effectiveness of that, and the result is, you know, he's still there, still broadcasting in a similar vein to as he was back then. Yes, I think some kind of independent inquiry would be a good idea, but I think, you know, sort of let the inquiry find what the problem is, rather than sort of try and push it down their throats and as your first move, just as a matter of advocacy tactics.
There's a question here which I imagine is rhetorical, which reads, why doesn't the BBC ask people in Gaza what they think of Hamas and how Hamas waged the conflict from within civilian areas underneath residential dwellings? But there is another question with respect to the reporting coming out of Gaza in relation to the journalists that are used on the ground. Do we know anything, Hadar, about vetting processes that the BBC might use in relation to the local staff that are employed?
I have no idea what the BBC's vetting processes are, if they exist. I do know that it's virtually impossible to be a journalist in Gaza if you're not part of the Hamas-run journalist organization in union in Gaza. So it would be very difficult for a journalist living in the Gaza Strip to actually openly come out and criticize Hamas, or indeed just do any serious reporting on the issue of Hamas. And so you see plenty of, I call it reporter in the rubble, pictures of reporters standing on rubble, but you don't actually see any serious discussion of what goes on there.
And there's never any mention of that, is there? No qualification I've ever seen of the BBC acknowledging the reporting restrictions. That
no. And that's interesting, because when they were covering the Iraq war years ago, they made a point of saying, this is what we can report. We are limited in what we can report. And I've actually challenged them on that in the past and said, you know, if you can't report from Lebanon or from Gaza or places like that, if you can't report freely, then you must say so.
Extraordinarily, in the interview with Bowen, it was put to him, given that he was embedded with Israeli forces in order to visit kibbutzim in the south of Israel, whether he was free and able to report what he liked, which is extraordinary. Quite a number of questions have been put, and perhaps I can leave this as our final topic because we have already run over our time. We've had quite a number of questions vis-a-vis the casualty figures. And the complete absence of that qualification, similar to the one we were just discussing, that of course that the figures coming out of the Gaza Health Ministry is Hamas controlled, and there is an indication, although I've not seen it elsewhere in one of the questions, that the IDF has announced today that it expects that what looks like 50. Well, that can't be right. So there's
something like 5,300. Somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 are probably Hamas fighters.
Or other terrorists, I think. But
so that's the expectation, and of course they're not distinguished in terms of figures.
No. Hamas doesn't. Hamas in the 2014 conflict, Hamas actually put out instructions for journalists and government agencies and ordinary people as well in the Gaza Strip. First of all, not to report deaths of fighters, of Hamas terrorists, and to describe everybody who was killed as civilians. And it seems that they haven't rescinded that instruction. They seem to be using it this time as well. Their casualty figures, we can't, there's no way of telling if they're true or not true whatsoever. They don't distinguish between civilians and combatants. They do very often try to put a focus on children and women and elderly people. And it's a propaganda tack. It's for propaganda. So the fact that, I mean, it's not just the BBC, to be honest, a lot of Western media organizations at the moment are quoting those figures, you can say, because they have nothing else, but they're not qualifying them enough. That's the point. They're not qualifying. They're not saying it's not logical that 14,000 people have been killed and not one of them is a terrorist. You know, it's just not logical, and that's something which affects public opinion very, very strongly. And I suppose at some point we will. There's organizations like the Mera Meat Center who do research into this, and in 3 or 4 months' time, we'll get some super statistics, how many were actually Hamas fighters and how many were civilians. But by then, the boat has sailed and the public opinion has been fixed, and we're in the same position as we have been in the past.
That's an important point.
Can I say something about?
Yeah, absolutely. But there is a track record on this.
Yes.
In terms of previous operations.
Yes.
Highly ignored. Jerusalem Post reporting that in 2021, I think the casualty ratio was 1 combatant to every 0.6 civilians. So a complete record breaker, it seems, in terms of armed conflicts around the world. Jonathan, yes. Please, could you come in on that? And also, if I could add an additional question that we can perhaps conclude with, which is we've concentrated really on BBC News services, but there are concerns amongst our audience that agenda is spilling over into other BBC programmes, popular culture programmes, things like Have I Got News for You? So if I could ask you perhaps also to address what we can potentially do about this spreading outside of news coverage, I'd be very grateful.
Yeah, there was a food program. Sorry. Go ahead, Jonathan. Sorry.
On the subject of casualty figures, I would like to say this, that in previous conflicts in Gaza, the Gaza Health Ministry published breakdowns of the figures as between civilians and combatants. Now, when this was looked at, and it had to be after the event in Israel by private bodies in Israel and indeed outside Israel as well, and also by semi-official organizations, and indeed by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the case of the 2014 conflict. The Gaza Health Ministry, the Israelis found that the overall total figures were about right in their estimation, but the breakdown given by the Gaza Health Ministry was fundamentally wrong. The Gaza Health Ministry has said that only a tiny proportion of them were terrorists, and most of them were civilians, and that showed how disproportionate the Israeli military action had been. And indeed, that was swallowed by Judge Goldstone and his colleagues in the initial version, in their report. Judge Goldstone, of course, reversed his view after receiving further information such as this, as the casualty breakdown had been all wrong, but it did have a very real impact. And these UN reports are part of the reason why the media get it wrong as well, including the BBC, and not limited to the BBC. You have all this UN propaganda coming in, and it's based on a propaganda that's secured by Hamas's control of what goes on in Gaza. So Hamas effectively manipulated the breakdown in those reports in those years. Now, interestingly enough, currently, the Gaza Health Ministry doesn't appear to be breaking down the figures. It's just giving total figures. It is breaking them down into men, women, and children. And I think they probably get those figures right, actually, because and the point is, of course, that someone comes into a hospital dead or nearly dead and dies. It's not very easy for the hospital to work out whether he's a fighter or even possibly she's a fighter. Because,
or even what killed them, because we know that Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad rockets are frequently in Gaza.
Yeah. And the other thing that even if they're children, if they're, as they very often are, 16-year-olds or 17-year-olds, those may well be terrorists, because a lot of the frontline troops of the terrorist organizations are recruited at that age. And there's plenty of evidence of that. So categorizing them as children does not mean that they're not terrorists. And that's another misrepresentation that's effectively made, or it's the way in which the public is misled. Funnily enough, actually, I gave a talk to another organization a couple of days ago, just before the IDF came out with the announcement that the casualties, they reckoned that the number of Hamas or possibly Hamas and other terrorists killed was about 5,500. I said that I thought, well, the overall figure was probably right at about, as it indicated, about 15,000. But that I would guess in this operation, which is a spectacularly difficult operation of trying to get at the terrorists in the tunnels underneath the buildings, that probably about 5,000 was my estimate of the number of terrorists. And so I was pretty close to the mark, it would appear, if the IDF's estimate is correct. But that's the situation. And this compares with the UN in 2021 produced a report of casualties in urban warfare, in asymmetric urban warfare worldwide, and found that for every 10 casualties, about 1 was combatant and 9 were civilians. So the actual effectiveness of the Israeli operation and the extent to which their precautions against harming civilians has been successful is, by global standards, phenomenal. This I think we absolutely need to hold on to, but of course it's not information that the BBC will be encouraged to share.
Yet we certainly have our work cut out for us. I'm so tremendously grateful, Hadar, for all of the analysis that you have been doing, and Jonathan for your continued efforts to hold the BBC to account I know that there is an awful lot in the pipeline, and the team at UKLFI is working around the clock on these issues. I'd certainly encourage our audience to get in touch. We can use all of the help we can get, and especially vis-a-vis complaints. They absolutely need to be being made. And we do hear from the editors at the BBC that they are taken into account. And that is going to certainly be important, whatever future action can ultimately be taken on the subject. We have run over, and I'm very grateful for your patience and that of the audience. We've barely made a dent in the question, so I think we're going to have to return to this subject. But as I say, thank you so much for your continued efforts, both of you. And I know I can see already from the contributions from the audience that they're enormously appreciated, as have your contributions this evening been very much appreciated by all of us.